Good morning and welcome back to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. It is Thursday, and I don't know, I think I got a full night's sleep for the first time in weeks, so I'm in a good mood right now.
Well, I love to hear that you're in a good mood,
But
Robby.
shall it continue? That's the question, Linda.
Well, I'm here, so clearly
So you
it
think
will
it will.
continue.
Indeed.
What's on your radar, Robby?
Happy to tell you. Let's get right to it. Dr. J. Bhattacharya appeared before senators yesterday for his confirmation hearing to lead the National Institutes of Health. An esteemed professor of public health at Stanford University, Bhattacharya became known for making thoughtful criticisms of the government's handling of COVID-19. He was interviewed on Rising. For speaking up against compulsory lockdowns, masking, and vaccination, Bhattacharya was muzzled by social media companies. Now, he argues that this was done at the behest of the Biden administration. During his remarks on Wednesday, Bhattacharya emphasized that public health had gone astray, and under his tenure, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, would no longer promote censorship and groupthink. Let's watch.
If confirmed, I will establish a culture of respect for free speech in science and scientific dissent at the NIH. Over the last few years, top NIH officials oversaw a culture of cover-up, obfuscation, and a lack of tolerance for ideas that differed from theirs. Dissent is the very essence of science. I'll foster a culture where NIH leadership will actively encourage different perspectives and create an environment where scientists, including early career scientists and scientists that disagree with me, can express disagreement.
Very important remarks. Now, it's important to reflect on the vast censorship that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic due to under the auspices of public health guidelines. Let me take you back to the summer of 2021, at which point the COVID-19 pandemic had entered a new phase. Vaccines were widely available for those who wanted them, and coronavirus cases had declined as the initial wave was beaten back. Now, even so, mass vaccination did not end the pandemic. The vaccines offered considerable protection against severe disease and death, particularly for the elderly and at-risk population, but they did not prevent infection. The frustration from the public health establishment was palpable, and top policymakers within the Biden administration blamed vaccine-hesitant individuals for, in their minds, exacerbating the pandemic. In July, President Biden said, quote, "The only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated." Among government health advisors, a consensus quickly formed that the main culprit was medical misinformation on social media, which I guess Jay Bhattacharya was one of the people guilty of spreading. Biden asserted that Facebook had blood on its hands and implied that regulation would follow if moderation on social media did not improve. As a consequence, social media company Facebook effectively put the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in charge of determining what kind of speech would be permitted on the platform. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy published a report on, quote, confronting health misinformation that encouraged social media platforms to prioritize early detection of misinformation superspreaders, limit their reach wherever possible. In other words, censorship. The Center for Countering Digital Hate, an activist nonprofit organization, coined the term the Disinformation Dozen to refer to the 12 social media accounts most responsible for the spread of anti-vax narratives and urged social media companies to take action. The anti-misinformation efforts were not just talk. They had a legislative component as well. This is what I really wanted to get to today. Senator Amy Klobuchar was particularly animated on this issue. July 22nd, 2021, she introduced the Health Misinformation Act, which would have granted broad new powers to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. These powers would have included the ability of the Secretary to reduce online platforms' protection from liability under Section 230, which is the federal law that immunizes websites from liability for user speech. In effect, summarizing it, Klobuchar's bill would have established that the federal government could use a public health emergency as a pretext to erode vital free speech protections at the whims of Health and Human Services. Now, it's clear whose speech Klobuchar was interested in censoring, people like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Also, her press release accompanying her bill explicitly mentioned that so-called disinformation dozen. Klobuchar and her fellow Democrats wanted to empower the HHS secretary to censor COVID speech with which they disagreed. Needless to say, the Health Misinformation Act actually never did become law. That might be a relief to Klobuchar at present because the secretary of HHS is now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. one of the very social media users accused by her and by Democrats of being a misinformation superspreader. If her bill had been enacted, it would have eventually empowered Kennedy, someone she thinks of and the mainstream media thinks of as encouraging vaccine hesitancy, by promoting the idea that vaccines are dangerous, that person to make determinations about what counts as misinformation online. Now, Kennedy has regularly condemned government-directed censorship of health topics online, so maybe he would have never used this ability. He has a principled objection to it. But look, it's not completely impossible to imagine some alternate reality where, say, the Health Misinformation Act is law and RFK's HHS is pushing social media companies to add warning labels about potential adverse effects to social media posts about vaccination, if that is indeed his view of vaccines. Now, this is precisely why the First Amendment vastly constrains the government's ability to make determinations about what kinds of speech are valid. Politicians would be tempted to propose new restrictions on speech that target their opponents, and even well-intentioned efforts to promote the public well-being are bound to be abused by whomever is swept into power next. Then there's the small matter of the would-be censors subsequently being proven wrong time and time again, so-called experts blithely asserting that anyone casting aspersions on social distancing, mask mandates, lockdowns, school closures were succumbing to misinformation. Yet the criticisms of these policies have fared better than the policies themselves. That's without even mentioning the widespread suppression and demonization of the lab leak theory of COVID's origins, which was initially branded racist conspiracy theory. You might remember that. It was vigorously censored on Facebook as a result. 4 years later, both the Energy Department and the FBI have concluded that lab leak is the more plausible explanation. Now, there's little reason to think that giving the federal government even more power to police coronavirus misinformation on social media via Klobuchar's proposed law would have benefited the public. On the contrary, it would have resulted in the censorship of worthwhile dissenting viewpoints, viewpoints that are protected by the First Amendment, regardless of the status of Section 230. But it's doubly ironic that passing such a law would have massively backfired. The very people the Democrats, the mainstream media, and Biden's health advisors wanted to silence are now in charge of the health department. I reached out to Klobuchar's office to see if she still supported this bill, and she did not respond to a request for comment by me. So I think it's a good cautionary tale, Linda. If you're going to propose some new government power, you must imagine that power being wielded by your political rivals, because we change who's in charge every 4 years.
You're right, Robby, and it's a great cautionary tale to the current administration about some of its overreach of presidential authorities that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks on end here, because it, of course, sets a precedent for what may happen when the tables may turn in the future and a Democratic president might be in office. This is why, of course, we have a government that is supposed to be, and you're going to argue with me about this, inefficient by design. We're supposed to be methodical. We're supposed to make changes carefully for exactly the reasons that you're highlighting. I will say, however, that if we are going to go back in the time machine to when COVID was going on and what we knew when we knew it, we do need to recall that we also had a president, the now again President Donald Trump, who at least 65 different times during White House briefings claimed that instead of vaccination, instead of medication, what we should be looking towards is hydroxychloroquine, things that you might use to clean your goldfish bowl, and some other now very seriously debunked theories about what one should be doing instead. The misinformation commander-in-chief.
Well, okay. I mean, I agree with you. I was agreeing with you, and then the agreement meter was decreasing as you kept talking. But obviously, I agree that Republicans in charge should wield power very carefully, yes, because opening the door, government via executive order can be undone via executive order as well. So if they're going to make all these changes that I support to the federal government, unless they're going to actually go through the process of having Congress legislate, all these things can be undone quite easily. Right. We're going to talk about a little bit later on the show about doing just that, about finally congressional Republicans feeling inclined to act to actually do something to support the Trump agenda. So I guess we'll leave it there. Plenty more to discuss and debate today. Now, one thing that the Dems can agree on is that they have no idea how to oppose Trump effectively. We will discuss. Stay tuned.